So the Prime Minister's former aide, Gerald Butz, testified in front of the Justice Committee, and with a very different interpretation of events. What was your take on it?
Different interpretation from Jody Wilson-Raybould, the former Attorney General. Some rejection of her allegations about what he had said to her in a meeting, for example, but mostly just relying on this idea that it wasn't really pressure, it wasn't really improper pressure, because all they were trying to do was to get her to get an external opinion from a retired judge or some such eminent person, because allegedly she hadn't taken enough time to come to the decision herself, and what was the harm, and all of which are interesting opinions, but they are not really their call to make. So it doesn't absolve you of the charge of having pressured the Attorney General on a decision that is hers and hers alone to take, if you come up with sort of stratagems for ways in which she can back away from that decision by calling in an external opinion, et cetera. I don't think this gets them off the hook for 1 second. I think this merely is part of the process of trying to normalize what they were doing as just ordinary run of business, when in fact it's highly unusual and highly improper.
But forgive me, Gerald Butz did say that two people can have a very different interpretation on one situation.
They can, but they can also be a situation where one of them's right and one of them's wrong. Just because two people make differing allegations about or different spins on events, that's what the courts deal with all the time. So we shouldn't go sort of throw our hands up and say, well, then we can't determine it. That's why you call in evidence. That's why you call in corroborating witnesses, et cetera. So I thought it was interesting, for example, that Butz said at one point, he didn't know that Wilson-Raybould had said she'd made her mind up and made a decision until last week when she testified. Well, she said in her testimony that she told the Prime Minister on September the 17th, that she told two officials in the Prime Minister's office who report to Butz at some later date. I forget, I think it was in November. So maybe that's true. Maybe all those statements are true. But it would be interesting that neither the Prime Minister nor those officials ever reported back to Butz on this. That seems unusual to me.
And they all work in the PMO.
Yeah. So what was particularly interesting to me was one way of trying to sort through that would be, let's have a look at the emails and texts and exchanges between those officials. And when that was put to the committee, the Liberal majority voted it down. I don't understand why that was such an improper suggestion to the committee of let's have a look at these emails and text messages, particularly since Butz himself, as was Jody Wilson-Raybould, was introducing their own texts and emails, et cetera, as evidence. Why are we going to just selectively think, let's get everything that's relevant to this case in front of that committee?
Which was a motion that was put forth by a Conservative Minister, Lisa Raitt.
That's right.
A big component I found of Gerald Butz's testimony was this 9,000 jobs, 9,000 jobs. We would have a public policy problem.
Yeah. First of all, there's a lot of question as to whether those 9,000 jobs are really at stake. SNC-Lavalin, the contention is, well, if SNC-Lavalin went to trial and convicted of a crime in this bribery and corruption case in Libya, that they would then be cut off from all federal contracts. And that is the law as it stands. Federal contracts are, Canadian business is about 30% of SNC-Lavalin's business. Federal contracts are about half of that. This is not the end of the world for them. This is not their whole business. Second of all, even if SNC-Lavalin went under, those jobs and those contracts don't disappear. There's lots of other engineering and construction firms in this country who would jump at the chance to take on that business and would have to take on those engineers from SNC-Lavalin to do it. So the notion that these jobs just go up in smoke because SNC-Lavalin has to go through the ordinary process of the criminal law, I think is highly contentious. But the final point is, that is a public policy matter, no doubt, but it's not a public policy matter that can be solved by monkeying around with the prosecution business. If you want to go in and bail out those jobs, that's another public policy decision, but don't use the court process and don't use the independence of the prosecution to do your dirty work for you. And that's where the line has to be drawn. You can be concerned about jobs all you like, but that does not justify with interfering with the independence of prosecutors. I'm
curious to get your perspective on the substance of evidence that was provided by Gerald Butz versus Jody Wilson-Raybould, who had a detailed chronology, copious amounts of notes.
Well, we were told that he was going to have a lot of incriminating emails and texts and things. In the end, it was on the meeting that she'd sent him a couple of, cordial messages after the meeting they'd had on December the 5th. I don't know if that proves anything. I think he's got more of an interesting case to make around the circumstances around the cabinet shuffle, where he says that she was offered the post of Indigenous Affairs and turned it down, and therefore the Prime Minister had no choice but to shuffle her because he couldn't set the precedent of allowing a cabinet minister basically to turn down a job. That may well,
but the rationale sounds plausible.
that part of it is plausible. So I would certainly like to hear her version of those events. When she appeared before, she was prevented, or so she said, so they said, from testifying on those very events. So it would be highly unjust and unusual to only hear his side of that affair. I would like to see her called back. I'm not sure why she can't be called back in front of the committee. More importantly, I'd like to hear from a lot of the major players in this. Up until now, we're basically relying on the goodwill of the Liberal majority in that committee to decide who testifies. And initially, they weren't going to call anybody. They weren't going to call Wilson-Raybould. They weren't going to call Butz. They weren't going to call anybody who was actually relevant to the matter at hand. But I would like to hear from Wilson-Raybould's Chief of Staff, Jessica Prince. I would like to hear from some of these other PMO officials and officials in the Finance Minister's office who were alleged to have put pressure on her. Again, I do not see what argument the committee can make in good faith as to why we should not hear from all of these people and get all of the facts and everybody's story in this, rather than just selectively choosing people who they think will corroborate their story and maybe calling other witnesses if they're pressured enough into it by public opinion or the media.
I'm curious to get your take as to why you think Gerald Butz came out to speak now. Because a couple of weeks ago, we were dealing with something very different. Nobody wanted to speak. Nobody wanted to testify. Yeah,
they were trying as best they could to low bridge this, to stonewall it, to just starve it of any oxygen, don't give any or give out these kind of perfunctory denials or non-denials by the Prime Minister, but not actually addressing the substance of the matter, and it clearly wasn't working for them. He had already said that he would testify. He had the benefit of testifying after Jody Wilson-Raybould, so again, that should be taken into account. I'd like to hear as another person I'd really like to hear from is Jane Philpott, because it's easy to say, and Gerald Butz was doing this today, basically implying that it was kind of sour grapes here, that the reason why she didn't why she's bringing this all out now is because she was shuffled out of justice. You really certainly can't say that about Jane Philpott, who was very robust, not just in defense of Jody Wilson-Raybould, but more importantly was harshly critical of the government in which she, until a day ago, served, that they had acted very improperly in this case. So why we should just set to one side that testimony or not hear more from Jane Philpott is another question.
What does that say, the fact that Minister Jane Philpott resigned? And, you've heard this quote as much as I have. I'm going to paraphrase and lift a part of it. I have lost confidence because of allegations of interference.
Well, it's extraordinary. First of all, this is a highly regarded minister.
How can this possibly then support the version of testimony provided by Gerald Butz?
Well, it's not necessarily inconsistent because, as I say, they're relying a lot on this idea that pressure isn't really pressure, that just because they were pressuring her to bring in an outside opinion, that didn't count as pressure. Jane Philpott clearly drew a different conclusion from what she heard about those events. We may or may not have heard all the relevant facts on this, so she may have formed that conclusion from the basis of stuff that we already know about, or she may have formed that conclusion on the basis of further facts that we're not aware of. But clearly she's a person to be taken seriously, as is Jody Wilson-Raybould, as is Gerry Butz. These are people of great credibility and great achievement and stature, so they all deserve to be heard from. But it is a hard question as to why, what's the motive you're going to ascribe to Jane Philpott for having either having a false opinion of this or a mistaken opinion of this. Remember, this is somebody who people talk about as a future finance minister, and she's basically just sacrificed that. She's stepped down from a significant job on a point of principle. She wasn't even directly involved in this. That's remarkable, and that certainly cries out for further answers.
Some other questions I think that come to mind with respect to Gerald Butz's testimony. I think he had to defend his reputation, and he owed that. Obviously, he needed to do that for himself. But secondly, an explanation to Canadians. And was that there? Was it enough?
I did not think it was enough to rebut the allegations that had been made by Jody Wilson-Raybould. He poked holes here and there, but mostly, as I say, it relied on trying to move the yardsticks. I mean, the other thing they did was to question whether she had brought to the attention of the Prime Minister, et cetera, what she thought was improper interference in her function as the Attorney General. Well, she testified that she did tell the Prime Minister, she did tell his officials. Well, now the question is, well, she didn't do it in writing. I'm not aware of there's any constitutional principle that it's not interference unless the person who's being interfered with complains in writing.
Right, nor did she do it in September, October, November.
Well, that's right. Well, and in fact, as I say, to her testimony, she did, and that even if she didn't complain to anybody, it's incumbent upon people as public office holders not to behave improperly. It's not incumbent upon people to complain about it. So you can introduce that as maybe trying to call her credibility in question, but of course he was there, he said many times he wasn't there to cast any aspersions on her. The person I would of course most like to hear from is the Prime Minister, who's at the top of this, who sets the culture for the people in his organization. So whoever was directing this, whether it was Butz or anybody else, this apparently multi-pronged effort to get to not only the Attorney General, but again, the question that was raised today was there were several suggestions in Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony that they were trying to get directly to the Director of Public Prosecutions. And as improper as it is to make improper interference with the Attorney General, it's nuclear improper to be reaching down into the prosecutorial bureaucracy and trying to make directions to them, as was suggested in her testimony. That was not rebutted by Butz because he said, I didn't know anything about this. All which is to say, there's clearly a cultural question here, it seems to me, in this government, that people thought this was okay. I mean, Jerry Butz may well sincerely believe they didn't do anything wrong. I think that's a problem in itself if the facts are as was alleged by Jody Wilson-Raybould. If they didn't think they were doing wrong, that's also a problem. And that is on the person at the top who is supposed to set the culture on this. So among the people that should be appearing before that committee, I very clearly believe is the Prime Minister.